I thank Stephen for his speech and now invite his second affirmative speaker, Laura, to take the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, the biggest problem with the opposition's case is their failure to recognise that any Egypt under either side of this debate is going to involve a large amount of control by the army. I think that the difference between our two cases is that under ours, we allow the army to be involved in democratic processes. We let them to buy into that democracy. We give them a way for them to uphold that. So we think that in terms of long-term stability for Egypt, our model absolutely wins. Richard gave you a lot of analysis at first about why that's the case. We don't think we've heard a sufficient justification from the opposition in today's debate about why it's not. Two questions in rebuttals. First, I'm going to touch on this idea about the legitimacy of the Muslim Brotherhood. Secondly, I'm going to talk about what's best for democracy in Egypt and in the broader region. In my substantive material, I'm going to talk about why our model has huge benefits for democratic practices in the Middle East more broadly, particularly among the Muslim Brotherhood. So, turning into rebuttal, what did we hear from Stephen? What we heard is that we shouldn't have this kind of cooperation because the Muslim Brotherhood have lost legitimacy, because they didn't uphold their mandate and they broke their promises coming into those elections. We think it's problematic with the opposition's case is that we haven't got any kind of alternative. I think the alternative to having them cooperate is that there will be either chaos, as there's no end in sight to the sort of protests and instability that is underway now, or we think that otherwise the alternative will be an authoritarian regime. We think the best way that you can get a legitimate government in Egypt is to have one that involves representation from both the Muslim Brotherhood and from both the secularists, like Richard told you at first. But we also think that, looking at the Muslim Brotherhood, we think that we saw that they were only in politics for a short amount of time, that they were a new government. We think that, new governments don't always function perfectly. And, we are happy to accept, on this side of the House, that mistakes happen, and, people need experience to be able to govern better. We think that what happens under our model is when you have the Muslim Brotherhood cooperating with other forces in Egypt, that forces them to continue being moderate. It forces them to look at better practices of government and cooperating with the other side of politics. And we think that that's actually the best way that you can ensure you get legitimacy of that regime. So we think that what happens under our side of the House, like Richard told you in his speech, that when you've got, what we've got under the current system is when we've got secularists controlling sort of one side of institutions, and then we have Islamists controlling other institutions. So the result of that process is that those two groups are shaping democratic processes in Egypt. I think as long as you allow those two groups to be separate, as long as you stop them from cooperating, I think that undermines the legitimacy of those institutions. I think it undermines the legitimacy of the courts, of the legal processes, and of the constitution. I think the best way to get a government in Egypt with a strong mandate is when you force those two groups to work together in a single government. We think that what that does is when those democratic processes are shaped, they get more legitimacy. We think that they're more widely accepted. I mean, that's good for stability in Egypt in the long run. But then secondly, into this idea about what's best for democracy. And what we heard from the negative was all of these ideas about why it is so harmful for the army to be involved. And what we think is as Richard made clear to you at first, is the army is going to exist in either world in English. We think that in Egypt. We think that ours is the only model that allows them to be involved in democracy. We think for the long term, democracy and stability of Egypt, we think it's absolutely important that you have the army on side. We think we want to have them on the side of democracy. We think that's the best way to ensure you can get that long-term stability. We think that's the best way to ensure that that government is less likely to be overthrown. We think when the army has a stake in that government and they've cooperated with that government, they're less likely to overthrow them. We think that is good for stability in the long run. It is something that we are happy to stand by on this side of the House. Turning into my substantive material, what I'm going to talk about is why our model has strong benefits for democratic practices in the Middle East, particularly in relation to the Muslim Brotherhood. And what we've seen is throughout the Middle East, the Muslim Brotherhood has a strong presence in other unstable Middle Eastern nations. We see that in places like Pakistan, in places like Libya and Lebanon and Syria. We think what is different in those nations in comparison to Egypt? I think what we have seen historically is militaries in those nations have played a key role in shutting the Muslim Brotherhood out of democratic politics. Why? We think like often that occurs because the Muslim Brotherhood is the most organised opposition force in otherwise authoritarian regimes, like we saw in Yemen and like we saw in Algeria. We think that like the result of them being an organised force is that those leaders have been arrested and parties have been banned and members of the Muslim Brotherhood have been killed. We think that's fundamentally harmful for a number of reasons. Why? Firstly, we think that the Muslim Brotherhood is a legitimate political party that represents the views and circumstances of a significant proportion of Muslims. What we heard from the opposition in today's debate is they have a history of being violent and a history of governing poorly. We don't think that that history is relevant to this debate. We think, like we have seen in Egypt, that they have shown a capacity to act in democratic ways. They have shown a capacity to engage with democratic politics. We think it is far more important to engage with the Muslim Brotherhood based on their recent track record of behaviour rather than looking back, sort of like what they've been doing historically in recent decades. We also think that the Muslim Brotherhood is much more likely to respond to democratic engagement. Like, how do we know that? Because we've seen, like, at the moment, the Muslim Brotherhood is not showing high levels of violence in Egypt. In fact, we think they haven't shown violence at all. We think that that's a result of them having democratic leverage now. That's a result of them being engaged in the democratic process. Yes. And we think it's a vast contrast from how violent they were 20 years ago in Egypt when they didn't have that same leverage. So we think that by engaging them in political processes, that what that does is allows them to represent the views of many Islamists in those kinds of areas and do it in a way that is productive and efficient. So what happens under the opposition model? We think like what happens when you don't allow them to cooperate and you shut them out of government in Egypt. We think that that shows the Muslim Brotherhood and their supporters. We think it results in them feeling disenfranchised. We think that results in them feeling unrepresented. We think that's particularly problematic in places like Egypt where there are strong divisions and tensions between different ethnic and religious groups. We think that also builds upon a strong sense of persecution which is present throughout the broad Middle East in nations like Yemen and Algeria where the Muslim Brotherhood has suffered sort of severe persecution. We think that like there are two consequences of this that we'll see. We think like firstly, rather than engaging in democratic politics like we're starting to see now and like we expect to see under our model, we think like the Muslim Brotherhood will be far more likely to turn to violent methods to achieve their causes. We've seen this with extreme elements of the Muslim Brotherhood in violent protests or in like instances of Hamas bombing Israel and other different instances throughout the Middle East. We think like that is something that we want to avoid. We do not think that the entire Muslim Brotherhood is obviously extreme. We know that they range from moderate to extreme, and we think that there is a strong capacity for the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt to use moderate methods, and we're happy to stand by that. But secondly, we think that what else we're likely to see is like there is more likely to be an uprising and reduced cooperation with the interim government because it won't be perceived as legitimate or representative to the extent that it excludes the Muslim Brotherhood. What happens under our model? I think that under our model, what it does is allows the Muslim Brotherhood to gain democratic representation. It shows not only that they are a legitimate party, but they have a capacity to engage democratically, to function well in democratic governments. We think that that gives them an incentive not to behave in violent ways, an incentive not to carry out violent attacks, but rather when they see that their goals can be achieved more successfully through participating in democratic processes, we think that what that leads to is more moderate behaviour, is more representative actions in those democracies, and we think that that is ultimately good for the long-term stability of Egypt. We think that also role models good behaviour for the Muslim Brotherhood throughout the Middle East. So because we stand for the long-term stability of Egypt, we are very proud to propose.